Hey, John, how are you this week?
I'm good, Joe. Thanks for filling in as you do several times a year for Elliot and myself. So Elliot's well-deserved vacation. He's out this week, but thanks for sitting in for him. Appreciate it.
I'm so excited to be here. I feel like I tell you guys this every time, but I'm a big fan. I hope that you guys take more vacations so that way I get a chance to be more involved in these conversations. But happy to be here, John.
That sounds good. So, a bunch of stuff happening both domestically and internationally, but there's a few more international things I think we want to highlight this week. One is an organization that we talk about quite a bit, Transparency International, great organization. As a quick aside, last week when Elliot and I were in the middle of recording, that's just the time that the Treasury and FinCEN issued their final rule on the Corporate Transparency Act, eliminating the requirement for domestic entities to have to file beneficial ownership information with FinCEN. They did that. Plus, they said they're emptying the database. So all the filings that previously had been captured and were going to eventually be utilized by law enforcement and potentially financial institutions no longer exists. So I'll just say that Transparency International has been pretty vocal about the downside of that, especially when law enforcement talks frequently about the need to determine whether shell companies are fronts for illicit activity. So I've also seen a number of both blog pieces and podcasts that mention this. In fact, several national news programs that don't always cover these types of issues have had at least segments on the fact that this database has been emptied and there's no longer any requirement except if you're a foreign entity. And I'll end on this point. We did our look back with Sarah Beth Felix, which by the time you hear this conversation, will have been posted. And Sarah Beth does talk at length about the elimination of that requirement, plus the fact that foreign entities can easily circumvent the requirements and become a domestic entity. And she also, in her Dirty Money Weekly, talks about that. So there's a lot on that topic. Again, we only briefly touched on it last week because it had just been included. So I wanted to mention that. So as a startup, a long-winded way of starting up my comment about Transparency International, they posted a report. The report is from April, but they posted it just the other day. And this is something under the category, what they call their help desk answer document. And this is their direction to members of the European Union as they have to put together their anti-corruption practices. The analysis in the report gives direction on what TI thinks is both a good starting off point and how to create those strategies. So that's available on the TI website and also if you follow them on LinkedIn.
That's right. The one thing that I would call out specifically too is for the first that with what the EU did from an anti-corruption directive, it's the first time that it's legally obliging all of its member states to both adopt and publish, an anti-corruption strategy. The interesting thing, and it makes for a really great segue, is up until they published this, there were still 6 states that had not done that, and those are listed in the report. They include Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Ireland. So again, the emphasis there is both from a legal obligation, but then also, the directive further requires the national anti-corruption strategies to specify the objectives, priorities, and the measurements associated to whatever their position was going to be. But I say the segue because Ireland was on that list of non-actor states, which interestingly enough, I know that we've seen some stuff come through in the last few months regarding Ireland's, I think what we reported on most recently was the risk assessment, but we saw something else this week around their AML strategy. John, what did you think about that?
Right. So they issued their national strategy on AML, CFT, and countering the proliferation finance strategy. And in addition to risk assessment as a strategic goal, Ireland also has 4 other goals: a national coordination, which certainly makes sense throughout the country and all the different agencies, a strategy on their regulatory framework, capacity building and outreach. So how do you message all this? And then international cooperation. So Ireland posts their strategy. As you say, they're getting, among others, that are getting ready for AMLA to oversee this, and then also mutual evaluations by the Financial Action Task Force. So all that plays into this. I would say that in terms of the strategy, and we've said this about the U.S. strategy as well, the evaluations from FATF are not just, is there a strategy, but obviously also, does it work? Is it enforceable? What are some of the metrics on activity of financial institutions and law enforcement? All those sorts of things. The document is 30 plus pages. They talk about the framework having three pillars, if you will. One is policy and oversight. A second one is safeguarding and monitoring, and investigation and enforcement. So again, Ireland launched their strategy, certainly in response to the things that Joe highlighted. So if you get a chance, take a look at that. It's available, obviously, on the Ireland governmental websites, and obviously others have posted this document on LinkedIn. You can find that as well.
So yeah, like you said, John, 30-page report. I think from 30 pages to the 38th report. Today is just full of updates on reports. But in terms of the UN and what they were doing from the Security Council, I know that they had just published their 38th report regarding, I think it was, on the analytical support and sanctions monitoring team, as it related mostly to the focus on ISIL, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant.
Yeah, it covers the first half of 2026, and they talk about some of the key takeaways. This is posted by a UN expert who kindly posted this and read through the document, and that is, here are some of the key takeaways. Kidnapping for ransom remains a top revenue stream, especially in Sahel, with proceeds moving across affiliates alongside the growing use of virtual assets. Beneficial ownership, that comes back again. Some affiliates increasingly lean on tribal sympathizers and unwitting third parties to front real estate, vehicle sales, local businesses. And then sanctions. There's a few movements in that list. But the document is anybody who's involved in security and CFT. As you said, this is another 30-page document from the UN Security Council and is available on their website as well.
Bingo. Now, from 30 pages to what I would argue is probably about a minute and a half read if you read as slow as I do. There was some news that also came out of AMLA regarding crackdowns on money laundering in the EU property sector. And I know that this is not the first that we've heard, that this organization kind of call for order, if you will, or call for, heightened, I guess, enforcement. But, in terms of what we're seeing, like what jumped out to you in this area?
I want to give credit to the folks at AML Intelligence who do a great job, both with their programming, but also their newsletters and information. So the chair, Stephen Ray, posted this, and this is his analysis of the report that you mentioned, Joe. They believe that money laundering in the property sector could even worsen the housing crisis in Europe's major cities, which is also a byproduct of this that we don't talk that much about, that when you have real estate fraud, it does impact the ability of regular folks to get access to housing. Some of the items in the report, this is a quote: distortions in the real estate sector in the form of increased prices are particularly harmful for our economies and societies, close quote. There's a full analysis of this is now available from AML Intelligence on their homepage, but also you can read the report directly. But again, wanted to give credit to them for highlighting this. They also say that criminal organizations rarely pay for property entirely in cash, because that could raise suspicions. Instead, they use standard financing methods, which I didn't realize, such as mortgages or reserving cash for down payments, that sort of thing. So again, a report worthy. As we talk about, this is a side issue, but I'll connect it. This has been 25 years since 9/11 and 24 plus since the Patriot Act, one of the things we pushed for very strongly for the Patriot Act was the coverage of the real estate industry. So 24 years ago, still hasn't happened in the U.S. to any sort of degree that would make sense. And that's because of the things highlighted here are still a problem decades later.
No doubt. And I know obviously you've got some cool plans ahead, especially with Dennis Lormel on that front. So looking forward to hearing more and seeing that conversation hopefully later this month, certainly before, that 25th anniversary. But kind of coming back stateside too, I think we've seen a couple things of note. I think the biggest was last week, the OCC reviewed the application for the World Liberty Trust Company, essentially asking for, or filing for a charter. I know that there's a lot of opinions floating around as it relates to this particular topic. What I would say in terms of what jumped out to me was, from a kudos perspective, if there is one to give, it's around the process itself. So in terms of how they filed, I feel like there was they followed the rules. They went through the process. They were very transparent with what they were asking for or applying for, and therefore were granted that conditional approval. But I know that there have been some reservations that have been voiced pretty strongly by members of the House and some others. But in terms of what you're seeing, John, anything particular that we should keep our eyes on here?
Well, what was interesting that when it was posted on a Friday night, and usually that's a news dump day, let's face it, although I don't think that's as relevant anymore because news cycles are 24/7. And so that's probably an old-fashioned way of looking at news at the end of a week. But when it was posted, as you just mentioned, at least according to some former OCC officials, the process was both transparent and seemingly consistent with other approvals. But several policymakers have suggested there is a very large potential for conflicts of interest, meaning that, World Liberty is obviously run by the Trump organization, and Trump's the president, and he decides who's going to be in these various agencies. So the question is, this is not something we've ever had to consider before, that the regulators of an entity owned in part by the President of the United States is going to be managed that in that particular fashion. So I'm sure many will watch this very carefully. Obviously, a number of supporters of digital asset growth have talked positively about this, both on LinkedIn and other places. So it's worth watching, but I will tell you that Senator Elizabeth Warren and several others have expressed major concerns about the potential here. We'll see. But, it's out there now, so everybody's well aware of what's happened. So I think that's because this is our world, and part of what they agreed to is AML processes. So it's going to bear continued watching by our community.
No doubt. And I would say, to further kind of balance at least the conversation, if I'm looking for a silver lining in all of this, when we look back at probably the last 4 or 5 years, just the volume of charter applications has significantly dropped off, and we're starting to see that come back. So, again, every example is very nuanced and has its own particularities to, obviously what's going to make or break that decision. But as a whole, I think it's exciting to see that, okay, maybe we're starting to get back to, a little bit of a growth stage here.
Well, just real quick, the letter from Warren and others is available on the Banking Committee website. And this is the quote, the pull-out quote from Warren. President Trump is now the first president in history to approve, operate, and supervise his own bank. This is the most, again, quoting here, this is the most brazen act of self-dealing our financial system has ever seen, and Congress cannot allow it to stand. Now, again, these are letters from the opposite political party, so you take that with a grain of salt, but it's going to be an interesting thing to follow. Again, that information and the signers of the letter are available on the Banking Committee website.
No doubt. And the two words that come to mind almost immediately are due diligence. At the very least, I hope that there's ongoing conversation. Switching gears a little bit. So, in terms of Treasury, have also been kind of busy as it relates to some stuff around AI. So I did see a report that has kind of surfaced about the warning, the Treasury internal report warning about the dangers of an AI bubble, which I think, depending on how many days you go without connecting to the internet or checking your phone, it's pretty likely that you're getting something from AI or you're, interacting with AI almost daily. So, it was just interesting that, in terms of the formal positioning and the messaging that we've seen, whether it's out of the administration or just more in general, we don't see much of a dissent as it relates to, the potential for harm similar in nature to the dot-com bubble that we saw at the beginning of the 2000s. Now, I would make a point to really call it out. The aspects of the dot-com bubble don't necessarily apply in the same ways that we're seeing with this AI. However, I think it's prudent for anybody that's really looking at the growth cycles of this new technology to take into consideration that things kind of ebb and flow a bit, but for the most part, AI seems to have just flowed. There's not been much of an ebbing, and so what I take from this is kind of twofold. The first is continue to use just good judgment when it comes to those that are heavily leveraged in this space, but more importantly is to take it for what it is, which my opinion is it's a tool. And so, obviously we're finding new and better ways to apply more and more of the tool's capabilities to a lot of different things we're doing in our day-to-day professional lives, our personal lives. And I think it is providing a lot of good. However, I think it's worth noting too that simply relying on it for the sake of reliance is kind of a short-sighted and quite frankly very dangerous position to be in as it relates to AI.
So this report, which has not been publicly released, we discovered in a platform called the News of the United States. The acronym is NOTUS. It's a fairly recent newsletter process. And so they reviewed this report that, again, it's a draft report, was not released. It was designed to give direction to Secretary Bessent. And according to the story, I just referenced this part, and they went back to Treasury, and the spokesperson for Treasury said something that Joe just mentioned too, that AI has the potential to deliver unprecedented productivity, expand economic opportunity, and empower American workers. The report said, though, that AI bubble popping, if it happens, would lead to less of an immediate crash than the dot-coms that Joe referenced. But the analysts predicted the companies would cut back, investors would lose confidence, and the economy would grow more slowly should the industry falter. Then they went on to say stock markets, private credit markets, companies financing data center buildouts, cloud providers, chip manufacturers, and utilities would all feel the effect, according to the report. Now, again, this report has not been reported anyplace else than this publication that I mentioned. So my educated guess is this will not be released, but obviously it was shared with a particular reporter for this organization. Anyway, long-winded way of saying, we're all trying to grapple with what AI means in terms of the AML community. I teach a class, and I always wonder if my students are using AI to produce final papers. I make them at least tell me that they've used it for grammar and punctuation and that sort of thing. But, that's so far ahead, it'd be really hard to figure out, are they actually utilizing it for content? So we're all trying to figure all that out. A lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle are pushing back on these data centers. I live in Northern Virginia. Loudoun County, the next county here, has the largest amount of data centers in the country. And so it's going to really be fascinating. And they say it's in part because of all the artificial intelligence that we use. Joe knows this space better than I do. Anyway, this is going to be something we're going to have to continue to watch. And I'm not sure how far ahead we're going to get, but that's why it's going to be a reactive issue, in my opinion. So I don't know, Joe, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I full-heartedly agree with you, John. My only offhanded comment would be send it to space. Right, that's really the only.
Yes.
It's the pipe dream, but really the only solution, in my opinion, that is worth pursuing in any real measure.
Right.
Now, I know that the running theme here has been we're now kind of deep into what Treasury's been up to in the past week or so, but there was one more thing that came out. I believe it was on Friday, and that was its call for public comment around the Genius Act. So, I'm pulling from this press release that was from the 17th. Essentially, the Treasury Secretary called for, quote, Treasury welcomes input from stakeholders as we work to provide the regulatory certainty businesses need to innovate and grow in America, cement the role of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, and keep America the crypto capital of the world. So to me, it sounds like, and I feel like we're feeling this, not only do we want to be the AI masters of the world, but now we're also trying to stay the crypto capital of the world. I'm assuming you saw this, but any thoughts around, obviously what we should expect to see, or certainly for folks that feel so strongly as to provide comment, which I would recommend. I think it's certainly worth the effort in that process. But from your perspective, John, what'd you see?
I'm not sure. They say that the expected effective date of this act is January of 27, which is not that far away.
No.
So it's going to be fascinating. There's still a lot of political issues to grapple with in terms of the whole stablecoin area. So, I read one review that said there's at least 50 questions that Treasury asks for comments on. So I don't write comment letters anymore. I spent a lot of my career doing that sort of thing. It was always a struggle to make sure that you could get as many questions responded to by, at that point, I was, running the Bankers Association comment process. So you would hope that people on all sides would comment about operational and legal questions, that sort of thing. So it's going to be another thing we should be watching. And obviously, once it's final, we certainly at RightSource will do content on that, whether it's a webinar or a couple conversations with experts, so that our clients get the best information possible.
Well, and a great point. I would agree. Tongue-in-cheek comment would have been, maybe we should use AI to help answer all those, but don't actually do that. But to your point too, in terms of programming, in fact, this month's webinar is on the risks of virtual assets. So while it's not specific to crypto, Elliot has put together a great panel that's happening on the 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern, where they're going to dive into the specifics around some of the risks associated to virtual assets, both from, exposure, but then also for practitioners and organizations that are effectively offering these types of things as a mechanism for transfer of value. So would highly encourage folks to do that. Shameless plug aside, I've reached the end of my TWIA list. Is there anything else that you had today, John?
Well, as we always do, as we do these conversations, things pop up, and something just popped up on my feed from OCCRP. Federal prosecutor, this is relevant to what we just talked about. Federal prosecutors in Georgia have unsealed a 25-count indictment against an American man accused of orchestrating a $165 million cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme that defrauded thousands of investors, just days after authorities in Fiji apprehended him and handed him over to federal agents. So this particular individual, Edward Zimbardi, was the subject of an international hunt for him. He promised up to 25% monthly returns for high-yield investment platforms before he fled to the South Pacific as federal regulators closed in. Anyway, that's available on the OCCRP website, and it is free. They look for donations because they're investigative journalists, but it's free. So no, I don't have anything else relevant to that. An investigative journalist and I are going to speak on Friday for a sit-down podcast where he's going to talk about some defense contracting fraud. And so we'll have that conversation and post it in a week or so after. So that's coming up. And my conversation with Sarah Beth Felix, you'll have access to by the time you hear Joe and I's conversation.
Absolutely, John. Well, another great week of Around the Horn. Obviously, the news never sleeps. And so, really appreciate you having me back on. Just as a plug too, all the stuff that we covered today will be available in the session summary. So anybody that's looking for that information, you can find it just in the summary description of this episode, and would highly encourage you, there's plenty of additional, value in the information that you can find on the AML RightSource website. So again, John, really appreciate you having me today, and stay safe.
Take care of yourself. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.